of Western Australia, is one of the foremost specialists in Asian regional and comparative studies, also an author of reference in multilateralism and world governance. His latest book, as mentioned, is Environmental Anarchy. It's a great title. I wish I had it. International Security in the 21st Century. It's out on Bristol University Press as of last year. Previously, in 2019, Professor Mark Beeson published Rethinking Global Governance. And before that, in 2014, he was editor of Reconfiguring East Asia, two very important books. Today, we have Professor Mark Beeson to talk to us on the impact, if any, of the Ukraine crisis in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Beeson.
My great pleasure. Let me see if I can share my screen before I do anything else. I've got a little PowerPoint somewhere. Here we go. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you again, and the kind words of introduction. And it's wonderful to see old friends again, and to see that you're all alive and well in Europe as well. That's all good, of course. So, but these are momentous times, and I've been asked to say something about the implications of the crisis for the Indo-Pacific. And it's, at one level, it's very important, particularly when Mr. Putin is threatening World War III to everybody, apparently. So clearly, nowhere is going to escape from that kind of consequence. But at another level, as I'll suggest, there are other symbolic implications of what's going on as well in terms of Europe as a model, and I'll say something about that as well. So let me start off by saying a little bit about Western leadership. And I don't know if you recognize this chap here. This is Immanuel Kant, and in many ways, he's a kind of symbol of many of the things that I think, at least, and this is obviously a very subjective and personal explanation of some of the things that are going on. But I think that one of the admirable things about Europe was the period of the Enlightenment and the rise of people like Kant in particular, who believed that human beings were capable of organizing their affairs successfully and rationally, and that a greater understanding of the circumstances we find ourselves in would lead, in Kant's case, to what he considered to be a perpetual peace, because people would realize it was simply unproductive, stupid, pointless, and futile to keep starting these kinds of major wars. And if there was one part of the world that we might hope had learned this lesson from painful experience during the 20th century, it ought to have been Western Europe. And it's sad but true that that doesn't seem to be the case. And we've got to relearn this lesson yet again. And whether we'll ever learn it definitively is an open and interesting question. But one thing we can say is that out of that great geopolitical contestation during the 20th century in particular, especially the Second World War, out of the kind of rubble of the Second World War emerged the European Union. And I should say at the outset, and some of you might find this a little bit difficult to believe, but I'm one of the world's biggest admirers and unreconstructed advocates of the European Union for reasons that I'll explain. But I think it's interesting and important that it proved possible to pacify and to put the relations between European countries on an entirely different basis from any that had gone before in hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, when Europe was one of the most violent places on the planet. And yet for the last 60, 70 years or so, it's been an oasis of peace and security. And all of that at the moment is in question. And it's really kind of interesting that this should be the case. But I think, to be fair, even before the conflict in the Ukraine broke out, it was clear that Europe had some major problems internally, and there were some things going on that raised questions about the durability of the European project in Europe, and certainly about the kinds of lessons that might be learned from the European experience and their possible applicability to other parts of the world, like East Asia, like the Asia-Pacific, like the Indo-Pacific, whatever fashionable label we're attaching to this part of the world at the moment. So the big question, I think, about what's going on in Europe at the moment is that are people drawing the right lessons, if indeed there are any particular lessons to be drawn from this European experience that are going to have implications for the rest of the world. And I think at the outset, it's important to recognize that for many people, particularly in East Asia, they were never big fans of the European Union, and they disliked the fact that sometimes the Europeans could be pretty condescending, rather pedagogical in their approach to the rest of the world. And there was a sense that everybody else should learn from the European experience and draw the appropriate conclusions. Now, while this might have been understandable enough in many ways, because Europe's really the only place that has done this kind of institutionalization of international relations and pacification of an entire region in this way, I think we have to recognize that in some parts of the world, Europe's problems aren't greeted with despair and sadness. On the contrary, there's some degree of schadenfreude, I believe the word is, about the things that are happening to the European Union at the moment. And I think the sorts of problems that are emerging in Europe, populism, authoritarianism, nationalism, questions about commitment to the European project are extremely important, not just for Europe, but for other regions who may be thinking about whether there are indeed lessons that could be learned from the European experience, and whether it's possible or even desirable now to try and replicate those kinds of institutions and practices in other parts of the world. Now, the reason I'm a big fan of the European Union is that at least for half a century or more, Europe's demonstrated unambiguously, in my view, that it is possible to institutionalize cooperative relationships between former foes and countries that have very long records of mutual hostility and conflict. And yet those relationships have been put on a durable, peaceful basis. And I think for a long period, at least half a century, this did shine like a beacon for the rest of the world in terms of explaining what could actually be done. And anybody who's even vaguely familiar with international relations theory would appreciate that this kind of outcome, this empirical example of institutionalized peace and cooperation, flies in the face of most of the key assumptions of international relations theorists, which might not be too important, but also international relations practitioners. And many of the people who make the big decisions about foreign policy, strategic policy, are realists to a man. And I use that word advisedly because most of them still are. And most of the people who are making the decisions in the world are still men and still making decisions that they think suit their particular agendas and national interests. Before we get on to talking about some of the key players, I think it's important to consider whether in East Asia in particular, many East Asian leaders will see Europe's problems as a vindication of an alternative Asian approach to problem management, to regionalism, to forms of institutionalization. And the principal organization in this part of the world is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and its various offshoots, of which there are quite a few these days. and other institutions that have been established. But in my view, to assume that ASEAN would be a better model for anywhere, and Southeast Asia and East Asia in particular, would be a mistake, because I think the historical track record of ASEAN, excuse me, the historical record of ASEAN, especially when compared to the European Union, is pretty feeble. Because critics say, and I'm one of them, let me confess at the outset, that ASEAN is more interested in problem avoidance than problem solving. The ability to be able to influence the behavior of their own members, let alone great powers from outside or even inside the region, is pretty minimal. And as I'll talk about in a bit, great powers tend to go along with ASEAN when it suits them to do so, when they judge it to be in their interest, not because they feel pressured to do so. So when you see an organization like ASEAN, which can't exert any influence on Myanmar, for example, which I think most people around the world consider to be a pretty egregious example of bad governance, brutalization of their own population, and something that's not to be emulated or admired, if that's the alternative, it's not that great, it seems to me. So, but some authoritarian leaders in the region are looking with, I think, barely concealed delight at the problems that are affecting Europe, and concluding that they kind of can't get away with, or they can promote their version of regionalism in opposition to Europe's, or as an alternative to it. So, but in my view, and I'll talk about this later as well, what we need at this particular moment in history are more effective institutions, not fewer, because some of the problems that we face, particularly climate change, which I'm obsessed by, and I think we all should be at this moment in history, some of the kind of problems that we face are unambiguously collective action problems that transcend national borders. And unless we have effective institutions that have some capacity and some design to actually address those kinds of problems, we're not going to get anywhere. And basically, our problems are going to get much, much worse. I think there's just absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. I'm thinking particularly about climate change, which was a difficult problem at any period, but when somebody's threatening to start World War III and a major interstate war breaks out in the middle of Europe, then it's even more difficult. But, so that's something to think about as well. Let me just say something about the backdrop to regionalism and cooperation in the Asian region that might put this in some kind of perspective. And this is a little map. All the maps and diagrams, you'll be thrilled to know, are all plagiarized from different sources. I can't remember where I got this one from, but it's a little map of the so-called hub and spokes relationship that the United States has been instrumental in creating in the East Asian region in the period since the Second World War, when America emerged as the dominant power in the world and in the Asia-Pacific region as well. And America's attitude towards the region was not to establish the sort of NATO-style institutional arrangements that distinguish Europe and their relationship with North America, but to establish a series of bilateral relationships with the countries of the region. So all of the major strategic relationships went through Washington, not through the region. So it was not possible until after the Cold War ended, and then it took a bit of difficulty and persuasion, but it was simply not possible for the Asian region to become an Asian region because there were these ideological and strategic divisions that were reinforced by this kind of hub and spoke series of alliance relationships that have been established by the United States. So this is particularly about the strategic relationships, but it's been difficult subsequently to create meaningful regional organizations of any sort. There's been a few attempts to do this with various things. There's an ASEAN Regional Forum, which is an offshoot of ASEAN, which includes all of the major countries of the region, as well as the United States, China, of course, Russia, even North Korea is in the ASEAN Regional Forum. And yet the paradoxical reality is that the ASEAN Regional Forum, along with a number of other well-intentioned, no doubt, regional institutions that have been established over the last few years, doesn't have any real authority or power to be able to influence the members who make up those various organizations. So none of these organizations, excuse me, have the kind of power or authority or, crucially, willingness to pool sovereignty on the part of member states that characterized the European Union, at least at the height of its powers. And clearly, there's a major test underway as far as the European Union's future and its ability to be able to keep the show on the road. But in East Asia, the Asia-Pacific, none of the organizations like APEC and the various other organizations that have started have had that design to actually institutionalize cooperation in a meaningful way and to achieve the kinds of outcomes that the European Union has been able to. And one of the consequences about these other institutions that have developed in the East Asian region is that the great powers, particularly China and the United States, but Russia too in some of them, they have felt entirely comfortable with these organizations because they have next to no influence over their behavior. And if they don't like the kinds of policy initiatives that are being put forward by organizations like the ASEAN Regional Forum, for example, they'll probably just walk out or ignore it or take absolutely no notice. So there's very little capacity to shape the influence of the great powers. And it's striking, one of the things about this particular little diagram is that some of the new initiatives, like the Quad Initiative, which includes the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, this is kind of back to business as usual as far as the United States is concerned, and some of its key allies like Australia, because they've always had reservations about the effectiveness of these Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, call it what you will, institutions. And when the rubber hits the road, as they say, they tend to revert to form and have preferred these kinds of strategic relationships, which they think bring together countries that are like-minded and liable to have a more demonstrable impact. Now, there's a question mark about India, which I'll talk about later, but that's the kind of general underpinning rationale for some of these organizations. Now, I mentioned that there's been a few new organizations that are developed that reflect this kind of normative and practical preference for old-fashioned alliance relationships. And this is a little cartoon, I think it's from the Global Times, the Chinese nationalist broadsheet that toes the line from Beijing. And it's satirizing, not terribly subtly, the AUKUS relationship, which is between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And just that membership of those states, I think, is kind of revealing, and I have to say, somewhat baffling and slightly depressing that it's such an anachronism in this day and age to be getting together those kinds of quote-unquote Anglosphere countries in a way that is almost guaranteed to alienate certainly China and the French, because there was a scandal about not buying submarines from the French in Australia, but also just about everybody else. And the British sending a gunboat out to the Far East, I mean, if anything looked inappropriate and something out of the 19th century, I think that was it. But this is kind of an interesting indicator of attitudes towards this part of the world where the sort of strategic capabilities of this part of the world are rightly or wrongly not regarded terribly highly. And these kinds of old Anglosphere comrades in arms feel it's more appropriate to develop this kind of strategic relationship amongst themselves than it is to try and do anything significant in another forum. So the question, I think, about all of this is what, if anything, the Indo-Pacific as a sort of organization can actually do to respond to some of the challenges that are being thrown up within the region itself, particularly the rise of China. And I don't think there's any doubt at all that most of the behavior, strategic behavior and policy of the United States and Australia in particular has been driven overwhelmingly by the rise of China and a desire to respond to that in some way or other. Nobody uses the word containment in the context of China, but I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that's exactly what they're trying to do with both AUKUS and the Quad agreement that also includes India as well. The kind of issue that people are talking about in Australia, the Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, has recently described the emergence of what he describes as an arc of autocracy. So in other words, there are these authoritarian leaders, particularly in China, but now Russia as well. And there's a perception that what's at stake here is a struggle between autocracies on the one hand, led by China in particular, and democracies on the other, led by the United States. And there's a sort of self-fulfilling logic, I think, to some of these kinds of developments, particularly when they're underpinned by significant outlays on new weapon systems, formalizing alliance relationships between countries that are not even part of the region. And Britain, as I say, is the most surprising example of this possibility, because one would have thought that Britain's claims to being a significant Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific power were long gone and disappeared with the empire. But clearly, not everybody thinks so. What's going to be difficult and challenging, I think, for the countries like the United States and Australia in particular, is getting an organization like the Quad grouping, which includes Japan and India, to be as effective as they might hope. Because it's worth remembering that India's been very ambivalent about its response to the Ukrainian conflict. India still gets a lot of its military hardware from Russia, and it's reliant on spare parts and replacements to keep all of that kit in working order. And so India's also, surprisingly enough, been fairly ambivalent about China as well, because it's had a recent border skirmish with China, and you would think it would be the one country that was really red hot to try to do something about possibly containing, or at least doing something about China, but it's been pretty ambivalent there as well. So as far as the Americans and the Australians and Japan too, India's a bit of an unreliable partner, and it's not easy not to see how they're going to be able to make that a significant part of containing China, which is clearly the ambition of the Anglosphere countries. So there's a number of different kind of agendas that are going to be difficult to reconcile. The other point to make is about deterrence generally, and about the attitudes of different countries. Now, deterrence can take a couple of forms, and I think one of the things that's become painfully clear in the Ukrainian conflict is that some people are just not being deterred. Vladimir Putin is clearly one of them, but so are some of his cronies who surround him, and whether he's getting good information about what's going on is another question that I can't answer. But it's clear that he's not being deterred by the military might of the United States. It's clear that China's not being deterred by the military might of the United States either, because they are still asserting themselves in, this is China, still asserting themselves in the region, and they're not backing off from America's expressed desire to provide a more formidable opponent in this part of the world. So neither China or Russia are being deterred by old-fashioned strategic balance of power considerations, which raises some pretty fundamental questions about the utility of these vast amounts of money that are being spent on new weapon systems if they don't actually deter people. And if we're still teetering on the brink, it seems, of World War III. So there's a big question to ask about that. So Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin clearly aren't being deterred in the way that we might expect, but it's also worth looking at this little map, which I plagiarized from this week's Economist, about the response of countries within the region to Russian aggression. And strikingly, not everybody is outraged and appalled by what Russia is doing. A lot of people in the region are relatively unconcerned about the strategic aspects of this and more concerned about the impact on rising commodity prices, grain shortage, price of oil, depending on whether they're an exporting or an importing nation. And I think there's also a sense that many of the kinds of processes and policies that are put in place are kind of Western initiatives, not necessarily that relevant or important to the East Asian region as such, and that in some ways maybe what's happening in the region is that they're being affected by the kind of blowback from a disastrous confrontation between essentially Western powers, if we think about Russia being broadly in that kind of European sphere of activity. So I don't think we can be certain at all that the concerns that are activating and concerning Europeans are going to be necessarily widely shared across this part of the world, and that there won't be a variety of different positions and thinking about what's going on and how people should respond to it. So I think what we can say as a sweeping generalization is that many of the countries in the East Asian part of the world are more concerned about distinct national interests than they are about any kind of universal values, norms, or principles that might be at stake in this particular struggle. So what might the Indo-Pacific region do in response to this? I think the short answer to this question is absolutely nothing, because when we look at the map, the Indo-Pacific region takes in an array of very, very different countries with often not a lot in common. Even the Southeast Asian countries line up differently when it comes to thinking about responding to China. Certainly, the Australians and the Japanese, maybe the South Koreans, they think about some of these questions very differently as well. But the key problem, I think, is that there's no overarching Indo-Pacific institution to take charge, to represent, to articulate a range of views about what could, should, or might be done in response to a challenge that's happening on the other end of the planet, in which maybe the Indo-Pacific can't do much about it one way or the other, even if they could agree on a common position, which is most unlikely in my view. So because there isn't this kinds of institutionalized capacity to do anything, then I think it's likely to make the Indo-Pacific region something of a side issue in many ways. And people, I think, will certainly be, different countries will certainly be more preoccupied with their own national concerns and the best way of doing something from their specific national interest. I think it's interesting that India, Apparently, people in India are more concerned about taking advantage of favorable energy deals with Russia and other countries than they are about long-term interests in securing a peaceful outcome in Europe. And I think the other thing that might happen is that because Europe is struggling with the best way of responding to and dealing with this kind of problems that they're currently facing at the moment, there may be greater push for East Asian styles of diplomacy, where sovereignty is preserved rather than pulled, and the chances of developing more effective institutions in this part of the world with real authority and capacity to actually do things will be reduced, I think. So, so that's a distinct possibility. So, at the beginning, you may have heard mentioned my latest book is about the environment. The last couple of books I've written about have been about the environment, and in my view, rightly or wrongly, this is still the biggest challenge that the planet faces. And one of the unfortunate aspects, of which there are many, of the Ukrainian crisis is it's proving a huge distraction from what I think is still the main goal.
Professor Beeson, we are not hearing you very well.
Oh,
I'm sorry. We are getting some interference in the sound. The image is fine. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
It's okay. Any better now or not? Yes. No?
Okay. Please
carry on.
I will try to signal you if something. Please do.
Yes, the sound from your end is not great either, but shall I carry on?
Please do.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, hopefully we can get back to some of these points in Q&A if you want to. But as I say, I think that climate change is still the biggest problem, particularly in East Asia. I mean, some of the biggest cities in the world, like Shanghai, Guangzhou, Jakarta, are going to go underwater in the next, if nothing else happens, in the next 50 years or so. And we're talking about mass migration of millions of people, plus famine, floods in the meantime. I mean, if these aren't absolutely major problems, it's hard to imagine what are. But the problem is we're being distracted in some ways, and scarce resources, even if that, you were just talking about the time available to policymakers, is being used up on something that we hoped, I think, that we had seen the last of. But the kind of qualified good news, I suppose, out of the Ukrainian problem is that, one thing that's happened is that the European Union has been galvanized into action. There has been a collective response to this kind of problem. The Americans have got involved, and that's been widely considered to be a good thing. But unfortunately, it's taken a very old-fashioned major conflict in a part of the world where we really thought those things were over. We weren't going to see a big war in Europe ever again. I never thought I would in my lifetime, but I've been proved wrong about that. And nobody is more pessimistic about the future of international relations than I am. But I didn't see this one coming. And that's an even bigger blow, I think, to some of the kinds of problems that we're facing, and our capacity to be able to develop collective responses to some of these kinds of changes. Because the last thing they're going to be thinking about in Russia at the moment is problems with climate change, of course, and they're going to be making a major contribution to them as well. So one of the depressing thoughts about all of this is that what we may be seeing is the emergence of fairly old-fashioned 19th century style spheres of influence. And I wouldn't make any guess about how the war in Ukraine will turn out, but one assumes that eventually they'll put the guns down, stop fighting, and start thinking about rebuilding the place, which is going to have a bit of an impact on the environment as well, of course. But maybe Mr. Putin will have carved out a sphere of influence around some kind of old-fashioned Russian empire. Maybe this will give further encouragement to Xi Jinping, because let's not forget, Xi still wants to get Taiwan back, and I think he'd like to do it on his watch and have it on his CV before he retires. And whether he's been encouraged or discouraged by what's going on in the Ukraine is a pretty open question. But clearly, all of this stuff that's happening in Europe is taking the attention and the heat off Xi Jinping and his kind of expansionist policies in this part of the world. But it wouldn't be at all surprising if this part of the world, all other things being equal, and that's a big caveat, but all other things being equal, it wouldn't be at all surprising if East Asia once again ended up being a kind of Chinese sphere of influence, because the dilemma in this part of the world is exactly the same in some ways as it is in Eastern Europe at the moment. Does the United States want to risk World War III with China, in this case, over the future of Taiwan? And my guess is probably not. And maybe we'd all be happy if that was the case. So maybe the United States will pack up and go home in the not too distant future, leaving China in command of this part of the world, maybe leaving Russia in command of a large part of Eurasia or Central Asia, and maybe leaving the United States and Europe to sort out problems in other parts of the world. But anyway, this is clearly a moment with huge historical significance, and more so for Europe than East Asia. But I think, my feeling is that if Europe isn't able to solve this kind of problem fairly soon, if it undermines the authority and raises questions about the competence of the European Union as a problem-solving institution that's able to maintain stability and peace in Europe, then that would be a profoundly disappointing and dangerous outcome for the world, it seems to me, because other countries might draw the wrong kind of conclusions about our ability to be able to solve major kinds of problems and possibly not bother even trying in the way that we might hope as a consequence. So I think the stakes are very high. Impact on this part of the world, maybe it's not quite as immediate, obviously, but I think long-term, it could set the stage for a world that looks much more like the 19th century than it does maybe than we thought the 21st century and globalization was going to look. But I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Beeson. The problem with the internet is mine, not yours. So it's so I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can. I'm just trying to figure out how to do the.
Okay. Yes.
Stop the screen sharing. Have I done that or not?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That's fine. Thank you. Now we have a period for questions. I don't mind if I start it and pick up where you left. Apparently, it's your point is well taken that the Ukraine war is an European war. It is, in a sense, stressing the regionalist dynamics, separating Europe from Asia, as in a sense has been the case since the beginning of the post-Cold War. This Ukraine conflict only stresses this regionalist trend as opposed to a globalist trend, which is, as you said, very relevant, namely, as we are facing climate change and we have no way to get around that. But at the center or at the border of this regional divide between Europe and Asia, you have both Russia and China in a sense. And so I think that, and that would be my question, that also very much at stake in the Ukraine conflict is the relationship between Russia and China. And it was very remarkable to see that what President Putin did before launching the invasion was to go to China. He didn't go anywhere else. I mean, he went to India in December, and in February he went to China, and the joint declaration of President Putin and President Xi Jinping is quite remarkable. It's the nearest thing to an alliance between the two countries that we have had since 1950. What, in your opinion, is at stake in this relationship? How will the Ukraine war impact the Sino-Russian partnership? Thank you.
No, well, that's an excellent question and not an easy one to answer, because people are making the point that for China, clearly having a close relationship with Russia is good in many ways, particularly when China is being pressured by the United States, because having powerful potential allies is even if they're not formal ones, is a useful thing for China to have. However, I think it's also become clear to China's leadership that the capacity of the West, broadly conceived, and particularly the United States, to impose meaningful and painful economic sanctions on Russia is not to be underestimated. And China is more deeply integrated into the global economy than Russia is, and potentially vulnerable to the sorts of sanctions that have been placed on Russia. Now, it's not going to be easy, and it would be painful, possibly more painful, for the countries that wanted to apply sanctions to China as well, because it's such an important part of the global economy. But I think, well, one hopes that would give pause for thought in Beijing about the wisdom of trying to take Taiwan by force, for example. But there's a couple of points to make about this. One is about the so-called logic of economic interdependence. And many people thought, and this is what the European Union seemed to demonstrate, I think, many people thought that countries that traded intensely with each other and had close economic ties would not go to war with each other because they had too much to lose. It was irrational. It can't sense. It would make no sense, and people wouldn't do it. Now, we've seen in Russia, despite the deep economic ties between Russia and particularly Germany, for example, that hasn't been enough to stop Putin from behaving badly. So that's one sobering conclusion to draw from what's been going on. The other thing is about whether Xi Jinping will be concerned about what's happened to Russia in terms of the pushback from Ukraine and the remarkable resistance they put up to the invasion. I think that surprised everybody, and people who are much more expert in strategic matters than I am have been surprised by the performance of the Ukrainian army. And so maybe Xi Jinping will look at Taiwan and think, you know, if it's hard to invade your next door neighbor, how hard is it going to be to invade an island that's reasonably well prepared, and maybe the capacity of the Taiwanese to resist a Chinese invasion would be greater than people actually expect. And it wouldn't be a kind of foregone conclusion at all. Having said that, it might be more difficult to provide support to Taiwan than it is to provide support to Ukraine. So there are all those kind of complex strategic calculations. But I think the big point is that there is this friendship without limits, apparently, between China and Russia. And we don't know quite what that means, but it might mean that their principal concerns are overwhelmingly nationalist and about making their respective countries great again. and that they may take comfort from this solidarity amongst autocrats and countries with similar sorts of values, and a fairly dismissive approach to the so-called rules-based international order that is supposed to be being promoted and keeping us all safe, according to the Americans and many others.
Thank you. I don't see any hands raised for Luis. Do you want to move in, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. In one of the pictures you presented, India appeared as neutral. In reality, in a situation like this, of Russia's aggression on Ukraine, countries that do not publicly and directly condemn Russia and do not impose sanctions on Moscow or respect the sanctions of others are in practice playing into the hands and in favor of Putin's Russia. Of course, India has many reasons for this stance, but in a growing front of democracies against the great autocracies, such as Russia and China, how do you see the cohesion of groups of democracies, just like the Quad, when one of the partners, like India, is behaving in such a manner in face of an aggressor just like Russia?
No, it's really difficult. I mean, I don't consider myself to be an India expert at all, but some people, raise questions about the quality of democracy in India these days under Modi, and so there's a question mark about how genuine it is. But my sense is that isn't the decisive factor in this particular set of circumstances. The reality is that I think, because of the longer term strategic relationships between the United States and Australia, but also Japan, because Japan, since the Second World War, has been entirely reliant on America's supposed nuclear umbrella and reassurance of strategic support. So those countries have been locked into the kind of American alliance relationship and closeness to the US for much longer than India has. And in fact, India's been ambivalent about its relationships with the great powers for a long term and not wanted to get too close to any of them and maintain some sort of sense of independence. And as I say, the short-term calculus of what's in India's interests in terms of energy supplies, military supplies, those kinds of calculations from a national interest perspective may well be outweighing any sense of obligation towards the other Quad members, because the question is, what is that relationship actually going to do for them in the short term? And India was very ambivalent about even getting back into this kind of Quad relationship in the first place, because they had some reservations about it and its impact on their strategic autonomy and ability to be able to decide things for themselves. So it's an interesting and complex set of affairs, but it's a reminder that just because a country is notionally a democracy, it's just not inevitably going to behave in a particular sort of way. The other big country in the region that demonstrates that is Indonesia, because Indonesia is not keen on criticizing Russia. Indonesia is not keen on being bossed about by China. It's not keen on relying on the United States either. I mean, it wants to do things according to what its leaders consider to be in their national interests. And just because it's a democracy, that absolutely doesn't mean it's going to be lining up alongside Ukraine and making all the kind of appropriate noises that the Americans, the Australians, and many in Europe might hope it would do. So it's it's another example of a country with its own ideas about its place in the world, and I don't think we can assume that it's going to be doing the same sorts of things that they might be doing in Europe just because it's a democracy.
Certainly. Thank you. I still have nothing in the chat or no hands raised. I don't know if there is any. Oh, Carlos Ruiz, please. Go ahead.
Professor Beeson, thank you for your exposition. And correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that in that part of the world, Australia is now the only country which is providing military assistance to Ukraine. Is that correct?
I think it could be. I would like to swear to that, but certainly they've sent over some material, basically a few sort of lightweight armored cars. It's not been that decisive. We were talking about half a dozen vehicles. I think they're quite large, and you've got to fly them a long way to get there. So it's not been an overwhelmingly significant contribution, but they're making a lot of political capital out of it in Australia, as you might imagine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. May I put another question? One thing that is becoming very, very clear as the war endures is that we are heading for a full-fledged energy crisis in certainly in Europe. Will this have repercussions? You mentioned just a while ago that India was buying oil on the cheap from the Russians. China and Russia have a specific relationship on gas supplies, also with Japan. Will an energy crisis go against this regionalist trend and spread all the effects of the Ukraine war all over?
No, I think for some of the, especially some of the poorer Southeast Asian countries that are heavily reliant on importing energy and food, because that's going to be the next card to fall, I think, because Ukraine's a breadbasket of much of the world. So the knock-on effects around the world, generally for commodity prices, could be very significant. And for some of the poorer countries in the region, their first priority and only concern is going to be feeding their own people and not having social disturbance as a consequence of some of these kinds of problems. So yes, I think the knock-on effects are potentially pretty severe. In the short term, a couple of countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, who are oil exporters, might receive a sort of short-term boost in some ways, but I think the larger questions about the stability of the global economy and the shocks that are going to be dealt to international commodity prices and energy prices are likely to be so severe that any sort of narrow national interest concerns might dissipate. And I think the big impact of this is just about the loss of confidence in our ability to be able to manage really significant strategic affairs and economic affairs as well, because I think the great hope was that at least the economy and old-fashioned interstate war was something that was kind of more or less under control and for large parts of the world, but that is becoming increasingly uncertain. And I think one of the problems will be that it may yet again exacerbate the gap and the differences between some of the kind of Western countries that are relatively well off, still fairly secure in the, not World War III notwithstanding, of course, but still relatively secure and unaffected by this, and some of the poorer countries. And then the perception may well be that this is a problem that was largely a consequence of great power politics in the North or the West, or however we're describing these things. And yet we in the South, the poorer parts of the world, are going to be on the receiving end of this and are going to be the most badly affected as basic staples of life shoot up in price and destabilize countries around the world. So the stakes are enormous, and the potential loss of influence for the West in broadly conceived terms, and for the United States in particular, and its ideas about crisis management, about economic management, those kinds of things. I think a lot of those could be profoundly undermined by this particular crisis, particularly if it drags on and if the Americans and their allies are seen to be relatively powerless in able to bring about a satisfactory conclusion to that. I think bringing about a satisfactory conclusion already looks pretty remote. Even if they stop fighting tomorrow, they've still got to rebuild Ukraine from the ground up. So, yeah.
I quite agree.
Carlos, may I
Please.
make another question? Mark, is not so much related with Ukraine, but I'd like to hear from you about the recent developments in the Solomon Islands and its alignment with China. For a long time, the Solomon Islands were under strong influence of Australia, and in 2019, the new Solomon Islands government stopped recognizing Taiwan and started recognizing Beijing, China, as the only China. A few weeks ago, already in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China signed a huge security agreement with the Solomon Islands, even providing that China may be called upon to restore public order in the Solomon Islands. How do you see this development as an Australian?
Yeah, well, I have to say that I should preface what I'm going to say by saying that my views are not mainstream. And I have to say that I find a lot of the current Australian government's policies towards the Pacific hypocritical, shameful in many ways, because they talk endlessly about the quote unquote Pacific family, which is a very patronizing, condescending way of talking about these kind of micro-states of the Pacific anyway. But they've done almost next to nothing in addressing the key problem that the Pacific Islands face, and that is climate change, because they're going to disappear beneath the waves fairly shortly unless something's done. And Australia's contribution to climate change management has been to open more coal mines, to export more coal than ever, and to do absolutely nothing at all about addressing climate change in any kind of serious way. That's the underlying reality about Australia's attitude under this government towards these Pacific Islands. So there's a great deal of hypocrisy about this mock outrage about how dare China establish a base in the Solomon Islands when it's part of our kind of responsibility in this part of the world and part of the Pacific family. The reality is that Australia's kind of neglected these countries for many years. And I think it's, in microcosm, it's a kind of illustration of what's at stake in the world more generally, because the Solomon Islands, quite rightly in my view, think this is our one chance to play off one powerful set of interests against another. That's, you know, and it's the US has suddenly taken an interest in the Solomon Islands, and Kurt Campbell has just paid a visit there. The first time a senior American official has been there for about 50 years, apparently, well, quite a long time. But they've taken an interest. It's a bit late now. But if the Solomon Islands can get the Chinese to build them a new port, to put up a few roads and buildings and whatever, good luck to them, I think, personally. And I think the chances of a Chinese military base being established in the Solomon Islands in the near future are not high, in my view. Could be wrong about this. But as I say, from the perspective of small island countries with very limited resources, next to no influence on the international stage, I'm not surprised at all, particularly given Australia's attitude for years and years, that they would look to another country if they're willing to help them out and provide vital infrastructure and development in a way that the Australian government hasn't for years. So I think the expression chickens coming home to roost springs to mind when thinking about this policy.
Thank you very much. Again, it was a privilege to have you, Professor Mark Beeson. All the best in Sydney, and thank you very much. I'm asking everyone to join me in a round of applause to Professor Mark Beeson. Thank you so much. It was a privilege to have you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Muito bem.
Carlos, se calhar para os nossos participantes recordar que logo às 6h30 temos uma nova conferência neste mesmo link Zoom com a professora Sutter dos Estados Unidos às 6h30.
Exatamente, um grande especialista da China. Vamos voltar a esse tema às 6h30 e contamos com todos os participantes. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Até logo.
Até logo.